This is a Hat Trick podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Hi, Armand.
Hi, Jimmy.
So this week, it's a subject which is right up your street, isn't it?
Sappho.
Sappho. She's obviously, as a poet, she is very famous at a level that people talk about her and have assumptions about her. And of course, her name itself has become iconic. But before we go any further, Armand, this idea of talking about Sappho actually didn't come from either of us. It came from one of our guest suggesters, Martha Kearney. And here she is.
Hello, I'm Martha Kearney, a BBC presenter. After the great heroic epics of Homer and Hesiod, we saw poetry that was much more personal, Greek lyric poetry. The writers were using the word I to describe their feelings in a way that you'd never have seen before then. And I've picked the most famous of those lyric poets, a woman. Not so many women poets do we know about now in the modern era. This was Sappho. She was pretty prolific in her time. It's thought she probably wrote around 10,000 lines of poetry. But very sadly, only about 650 survive. And the one that I've picked is known as Fragment, because these were fragments, Fragment 31. And it's just incredible because of its intense description of jealousy. We don't know what happens next in the poem. We can only guess. One of the most brilliant fragments of antiquity.
Thank you, Martha, for that great suggestion. We'll read out that fragment a little later on and delve into some of your comments. But before that, let's give a bit of background on Sappho. When was she writing her poetry?
So we're talking about around 600 BC.
So before what we now refer to as classical Athens.
Yeah, so you might say the archaic period.
Right.
The archaic period in Lesbos, which is an island off the coast of Asia Minor, so not central Greece of any kind. But she was so famous in that island at that time that her poetry was disseminated through the Greek world. And by the 5th century, when Athens is flowering in an empire, it is being sung in parties, in symposia, in Athens itself. So somehow this woman, uniquely amongst ancient authors and poets,
Who are mainly men.
who are all men,
Yeah.
is so famous that she comes to be known as the 10th Muse. So there are 9 muses of poetry and dance and music, and she's the 10th muse because her poetry is so beautiful and her songs. We should really talk about her as a singer.
Right.
And this comes back to a word Martha used, lyric, which people kind of take. She's a great lyric poet, and Martha's absolutely right. One of the key things about the post-Homeric poetry was that people were using the I. This is about me. It's a personal story. It's not a narrative such as Homer's epics were. But lyric strictly means sung to the lyre. So,
Of course it does.
so that's what it comes from. And so the thing is that when we talk about lyrics, we're talking about things that were made to be sung to music, the music of the lyre, and that is what she was doing.
We should explain maybe what a lyre is for people under the age of 10.
A lyre is a stringed instrument that consists of a tortoise shell from which 2 arms made of wood are attached onto the tortoise shell, and then there's a bridge across, and there are strings, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 strings stretched across from the bridge to the bass.
And it was plucked, was it?
And it was plucked.
So it wasn't
it's a bit
strummed,
like
it was plucked.
It's a kind of equivalent to a guitar.
What was the Greek word for lyre?
Well, the main word is lyra, which is where we get our word lyre, but one of the words they used for a lyre was kelius, which means a tortoise shell.
Kelius. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of synecdoche, is it?
Synecdoche, shell for lyre. Very good. Oh, God, that's a difficult word, isn't it? It means part for the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you talk about a tortoise
It's
shell, but you mean a lyre.
It's in the ancient Greek, don't worry about it. That's interesting that all her poems were doing set to music.
Yeah, she was singing them. And, as far as we know, they would have been written down once she composed them, but she was not sitting down and writing poems. She was a singer-songwriter whose lyrics survived because somebody thought fit to write them down.
Kind of Bob Dylan of the ancient world.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
or Joan Baez, or whatever.
Isn't Bob Dylan, he's a woman, isn't he?
Not under Trump, I'm afraid you're not allowed to identify.
So she'd turn up at a wedding or a religious festival or...
Right. So this is what we have to speculate, because we don't know. We are not told what social life in archaic Lesbos was like. It's likely that she was reasonably highborn and reasonably educated for what it means in those times. She could use words beautifully and simply to produce poetry about love and about marriage and about weddings. So you're right. We have some fragments, and Martha's absolutely right. Nearly all of her poetry is fragmentary. It's come down to us in bits.
And she was much referred to, wasn't she, by successive writers? And
Yes, indeed. She had a huge influence. And this brings us on to the fragment Martha has chosen, fragment 31, which she says is about jealousy. Now, it is a terribly passionate and powerful fragment, but it's not about jealousy. It's an easy mistake to make, and I'll tell you why. Because this fragment was copied and worked with by the Roman poet Catullus. And we've spoken about Catullus.
Yes,
and we've talked about his
sort of translation of it, isn't it?
Yeah, his translation, poem 51, in which he is expressing some kind of jealousy for the man who is sitting opposite the girl he loves, whom he calls Lesbia. So people have read the original, which Catullus takes, as if it's saying the same thing. But let me read it first and tell you what it means. He seems to me like gods in heaven, that man who sits across from you and bends his head to listen to your lovely voice and charming laugh, which puts my heart to flight within my breast. For when I catch the merest glimpse of you, my voice is gone. My tongue's congealed, a subtle fire runs flickering beneath my frame. My eyes see blank, a buzzing noise assails my ears. My sweat runs cold, and all my body shakes. My face turns sallower than grass. It seems as if I'm just an inch from death. But all is worth the risk, since... and that's where it breaks off.
Wow.
So it's a fragment. And you may have heard that as a list of symptoms that affect Sappho when she sees this woman. So that's what's important to her. Now, the idea that it begins with a man who's not spoken about, and she says, he seems to me like gods in heaven, because he can listen to you and have your company without falling to pieces. Whereas Sappho says, I just have to catch a glimpse of you, and all these things happen to me. I'm immobilized.
And it's also a very relatable situation to find oneself. I mean, you know, if you're in the company of someone who you're incredibly attracted to, sometimes you can be. I mean, that's the song. That's the whole song. "Creep" is based on that by Radiohead, where the song talks about how I just feel like a creep when I'm near you.
Indeed.
I actually assumed that it was about jealousy, but you're right. It's through the lens of the Catullus verse that you project onto that.
Yes, exactly.
She's madly jealous of this guy.
And in fact, the very first words of the poem, he seems to me like gods in heaven. Yeah. The phrase in Greek, istos theoisin, equal to gods, is a phrase found in Homer where someone is considered to be hugely admirable. They're equal to gods. I mean, so you're an amazing guy because you can listen to this girl's talking and laughing, and so
there's a little bit of envy there.
Well,
envying the quality,
admiration, envy, whatever. But really, that's not the key point of this.
It's not as visceral as Odi et Amo, is it?
No.
Which is I love and I hate, which is the Catullus, if you like, reimagining of that moment.
Yes, I hate and love.
At the party where he's with his girlfriend, but she's with another bloke.
Right.
And he can't stand it. And he's actually angry and he's upset and he's excrucio. He's feeling excruciating pain. And he's blaming. It's a kind of blaming bit, whereas this isn't. This is a more self-reflective thing that Sappho's going through. She's auditing her feelings in a very delicate way, which one might say is a maybe more female way of addressing a problem than a male way of addressing a problem.
And indeed, it goes on to talk about her reaction to seeing this girl, which makes it clear that that's the point of these first 4 verses of a poem that must have been probably twice as long. Because if you think about it, it ends with but. So the bit that's lost, but all is worth the risk.
Yeah.
Goes on to say something about you can risk all these feelings that make you nearly dead. It seems to me as if I'm just an inch from death, she ends with. But why can you risk all those feelings? Well, if one looks at the rest of Sappho's oeuvre, there are a couple of poems where it's very clear that she's quite upbeat about her chances in love affairs. So her very first poem, which is the only non-fragmentary one, is an address to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And she says, will you come and help me because I'm not being reciprocated in my love for a woman? And Aphrodite says, look, even though she's fleeing you now, she will chase you later. So Sappho ends with, come and be my ally in this fight. And there's, quite obvious military imagery there. So for Sappho, unlike Homer, say, and unlike men who fight in reality and kill, it's all about the fight for love. And in another fragment, fragment 58, some of which was quite recently rediscovered, actually, on a bit of Mummy, I think in 2005, they peeled off the Mummy casing and they found this papyrus with Sappho poetry. That poem similarly says, look, I'm getting older and my knees are failing me, but you can't be old forever, but I still have music and love in my life. So it ends with this kind of upbeat. There's an uptick to a lot of Sappho's poetry. Now, what people have done with this poem, he seems to me like gods in heaven, is they've said, look, this is a list of symptoms. She's nearly dead. And those final words, which in Greek, alla pan tolmaton, they've said mean, but it all must be borne. Everything must be endured. Now, if you take that view of those words, then it's resignation. Oh God, I see you and I've got to endure this because life is hell and we all die in the end or whatever. But that's not what the words actually mean. And this was known in the 19th century. It was pointed out that the correct translation is, but everything must be ventured. In other words, all is worth the risk. You've got to venture, who dares wins. And that's what she's going to surely have gone on to say.
Yeah.
But I've actually reconstructed a few verses, and I think she said something like this: but all is worth the risk, since, love, you time on time crush lord and serf. You who of old brought down great kings and cities proud, yes, holy Troy for Helen's sake, and Peleus' son and all the Greeks. But Menelaus, he once more gazed on his wife. He left the boulevards of Troy and home had made his sweet return and laid his golden head to rest on Helen's lap. Now, Cypris, that's Aphrodite, let me love again. Leave hurt and painful strife behind. So may I prove that all my pain is not in vain. Okay, so that is my reconstruction of 4 verses. So we have 4 saying everything's falling to pieces when I see you. But this is coming back and saying, you know what? You can love and
this would be a song that she'd be singing to a group.
Song.
So if you want to go down well with an audience, you begin with the quest, you begin with the problem, and then you end with the solution. That is a dramatic arc right there. I feel terrible, I feel worthless, but you know what? It's all worth it because I think I'm in with a shot.
Yes, I think that's exactly what she is saying. And what I've done here is I've reconstructed a whole poem out of quite a long fragment, and I've given rationale for doing so in an academic paper. But a lot of people think that the fragments themselves are rather evocative as fragments. So Anne Carson's translation, excellent translation, she'll put just a single word or a few words on the page, and people will say, well, that's somehow very meaningful in its own way. And that's fair enough. That's how it's come down to us. But I think we have to recognize very clearly that these were not composed as fragments. They were composed as whole songs. And it's worth thinking about what those whole songs were, as well as enjoying the fragments for their own sake.
But I guess that also speaks to the fact that a pithy 2-liner can actually make an impact.
Yes.
And you can remember it more easily. I mean, it's a bit like the ancient version of TikTok in a way. I mean, is that you have a long... Like, we produce half-hour programs, and yet what we discover in the modern age is that they are reversioned into 1 or 2 minute chunks, put on the internet, and they'll take away a piece of Have I Got News for You or another comedy, and it's a fragment. It's a fragment of the greater part, but for them it's very satisfying. So the fragment can be very satisfying, I guess, as well as the longer work. And certainly, as a student studying, I was always very grateful when the 95 plays of Euripides hadn't survived.
Yes.
There were only 7.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, let me give you a taste of some of the fragments that have come down to us. Like this. I tell you, someone will remember us in the future.
Brilliant.
I mean, just that. We don't know what the whole song was about, but just that fragment survives. Another one is this rather lovely short poem. The moon has set and the Pleiades. It's the middle of the night. Time passes, but I sleep alone.
See, I think you should do these on TikTok. You get a massive following.
Yes, yes. Well, that...
Armand and Jimmy sing Sappho. Sappho, I mean, she's declaring her love for another woman.
Yeah.
How would that go down in the ancient world?
Right. No, she certainly wrote poetry which expressed love for women, and she uses the goddess Aphrodite as the goddess of love. She talks about being in a group of women on the island of Lesbos, and some people have thought she was teaching them to become marriageable.
Was she married herself?
She, at some stage, was married. Yeah.
Had children?
Well, there is possibility that she had a daughter called Cleis, who she does write about.
Oh, okay.
But it may be that Cleis was not actually her daughter.
But a younger woman who
Yeah.
she was having some kind of friendship with.
She certainly loved young women, but she was also a wedded woman, as far as we can tell, at some stage. And she supposedly fell in love with a man, and it was not requited, and she jumped off a cliff, killed herself.
Yes.
So that's one of the stories about Sappho, that she died for love of a man. So the basic idea that she was not wholly committed to, as it were, the lesbian lifestyle, I think was known. And you have some curiosity about the idea that she loved these young girls. I mean, her poetry is not explicit about it, but it's clear. I mean, she has a lovely poem, poem 16. She says, "Some say a troop of cavalry or marching men or ships of war is the finest sight on this dark earth. I say it's who you love. This is an easy thing to prove to everyone, since Helen, far the loveliest of womankind, forsook the best of men and sailed across the sea to Troy without a thought for those she'd left behind, her child and parents dear. But unresisting she was led by Aphrodite. See, a mortal mind is lightly turned. For me, it's Anactoria I think of, far away. I'd sooner watch her lovely lilt, the sunlight glancing on her face, than all those Lydian chariots and marching men-at-arms." A clear contrast between the world of warfare, this is what men like to see, and I just say it's who you love.
She's a lover, not a fighter.
Yeah, and the person I love is Anactoria. It's this girl. Whether she's married, whether she's single, we don't know any of these details, but it's an expression of the kind of love that she feels for this woman. Now, that sort of thing was then taken and made fun of. Actually, there's a lyric poet called Anacreon in the late 6th century who talks about lesbians. They're not going to be interested in me. I'm a white-haired old man. They're gaping after some blonde girl. And there might even be a sexual double entendre there about opening their mouths. So it was thought of, it was to some extent laughed at, but it was recognised that love for women was what characterised Sappho. And, there's some very kind of moving expressions of love for young girls and women in Sappho's own poems.
Well, that's what I'm asking, is that she was very open about her feelings.
Yes.
I mean, thankfully these days, we can love who we love and there's less judgment around. I mean, who knows, in Trump's America, maybe it will come back. But, it wasn't so long ago that to be gay in this country was illegal. So,
yes.
And clearly the ancient Greeks, or the archaic Greeks, were quite, seemingly, she became very popular. They were we would call quite modern in their
there's
acceptance.
Perhaps a couple of things to be said about it. One was that she was singing to a closed circle. So it's possible that within that circle, all this was quite acceptable. And the other is that her poetry is not gendered. It's surprisingly ungendered. So you can use these songs and replace them with your own feelings about someone, as Catullus does, replaces her song about this man who I'm looking at. And you can sing them from the point of view of a man about a woman. And this is indeed what must have been done. So you aren't necessarily totally taking on board the idea of a lesbian expression when you're singing a song of Sappho. You could be a man talking about another man. You could be a man talking about another woman. Woman talking about a man. You know, they are love songs. And I think perhaps we should think of them first and foremost as works of aesthetic value rather than something that, you know, pins down a particular biographical moment. Yes, we can speculate about all that. And you're right, it does seem unusual. And in certain areas of ancient Greece, certainly homosexuality of all kinds was permitted at some times. And it was then frowned on a bit more by the Romans. Though, having said that, lesbianism never really was a big thing. And it was, you say it was illegal. Well, actually, I don't think lesbian homosexuality was.
There was
illegal.
no legality around it. It was just completely ignored.
It was assumed that it didn't exist,
Yeah.
actually. Women could be friends. It wasn't the same thing. You know, you're not talking about the same kind of penetrative sex as you would with a man and a woman, or indeed with a man and a man. And that is what was subject to legal sanctions in Britain and elsewhere, and still is some places, of course.
So, is there a link then between Sappho, Lesbos, and the word lesbian then?
The word lesbian, we understand to mean homoerotic now, but in Sappho's time, it wouldn't have been understood to mean what we understand by it at all. It didn't exist with that meaning until the 19th century.
Ah, okay.
In fact, I think the people of the island of Lesbos actually tried a few years ago to prevent its use to mean what we generally mean.
How did they do that?
Well, they tried to raise some kind of legal case,
law.
yes, to say that, you know, a lesbian should be an inhabitant of the island of Lesbos, which is what Sappho was. And in fact, the word for someone who indulged in lesbian sex, up until sometime in the 19th century, was tribad. A tribad. And a tribad comes from the Greek root tribo, meaning to grind.
Yes. Yes.
There is actually a physics of tribology, which is to do with friction.
That's a good word for Scrabble.
And
Tribology, okay. I'm
anyway,
making note of that.
But tribad gave way to this term lesbian as the poetry of Sappho became of interest to romantic authors and so on. After all, it's clear when you read Sappho's poems and you read about her effusive love for the women she talks about, that something's going on. We can't say it's explicitly sexual, but, you know, it's lesbian love of a kind. So it's fair enough to interpret the term lesbian to mean homoerotic sexual love.
So where does she sit then in the constellation of ancient literary stars?
Possibly the greatest.
You'd say that?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think a lot of people felt that. They felt more moved by Sappho than any other of the singer-songwriters. And we know something about the music of Sappho. So the melodic nature of her songs, she sang, we're told, one of her favourite modes was the so-called mixolydian. And we know what the notes of that mode, a mode is a kind of scale. And what's interesting about that particular mode is it has, at the top of the scale, it has what's called a tritone, which is an interval of 4.5 tones. So you get a scale like this. Da, 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 da. That's your tritone. So that must have been terribly emotive. Da, 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 da. And she was singing with that scale, perhaps emphasizing some poignant moments with that tritone. And what I love is a story told much later by an author called Aelian, Christian author of 2nd century AD, in which he talks about Solon of Athens, who was a contemporary in Athens.
The dictator.
Well, not so much that, the lawgiver.
Oh, yes,
lawgiver of Athens. And Solon, according to this story, was listening to his nephew singing a song of Sappho. And he said, "Teach me that song." And they asked him, "Why are you so eager?" And he says, "So that I may learn it and die." What we would say is so that I can die happy once I've learned it. He was so struck by the beauty of this song. And unfortunately, we're not given the details. Was it the way the boys sang it? Was it the words of the song? Was it the melody in which it was sung? Was it the poignant sound of it? It could have been all those things. But I love the thought that someone was listening to Sappho and said, so that I may learn it and die. That, I think, sums up the effect she had on people of the ancient world.
And continued for centuries after.
And continued for centuries after, yeah.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Melville. The producer is Diggory Waite and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible, alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject. They hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.